Her mother just patted her head and agreed that she was a big girl and that she was very proud of her toileting abilities. Then Sarah joined them, new diaper in her hand at last. Only she wasn't immediately pinning it on him. Instead, she'd stopped to chat with the damned rubberneckers. "I see Brian has a little audience," she chuckled. "Yes, my Cindy is just fascinated with babies who still need diapers, I'm afraid." "I hope you don't mind," the other mother said. Brian rolled his eyes at the woman asking Mama if she minded when it was he who was being put on display. "No problem at all. It must be nice to have your baby out of diapers," Sarah told the woman. "No to baby," Cindy piped up. "Baby gotta wear diapers. Me go pee-pee in da potty and got big gul panties see," she declared, yanking down her shorts to reveal her Tinkerbell print pull-ups. "Cindy, big girls don't show people their undies," her mother reminded her, pulling the girl's shorts back up. "So we mommy," she pouted. "Oh, it's okay, I can see she's just very proud to be a big girl," Sarah assured. "Thanks, but she needs to learn not to go around flashing people." "Oh well, kids will be kids. She's much too little to have a sense of modesty yet." The mothers shared a knowing nod and Cindy was finally led away, waving bye-bye to the baby. Mama then turned her attention back to her boy, slipping the new diaper under him and praising his good behavior. "Thank you for staying put, dear, you've been a very good baby." Once his penis was wiped clean and he was well powdered, the diaper was finally closed up and the romper snapped shut again. Then it was he who was lifted onto Mama's hip while Meggie rode in the stroller. Gymboree. Gymboree was bustling with children and their carers when they walked in. They spotted Joy and Amanda immediately, waving at them from middle of the play area. Sue was creeping on her tummy at their feet, mouthing a big soft bean bag. Danny was apparently practicing standing, Joy holding both his hands while he stood with bowed knees and in-turned toes, babbling with delight at his newfound ability to be upright. "Look, Rachel, it's your brother and his standing up," Sarah told the girl in the stroller. Sarah brought them inside the play center and Brian couldn't help but look about with some wonder. There were just so many bright colors, oversized bouncy balls, slides, ramps and toys. It was a lot to take in. Meggie was beside herself, slack-jawed with awe as she took in the room through an infant's eyes. The reception area was separated from the rest of the room by a low barrier. The welcome desk and a row of chairs for visitors and parents sat along the wall. There was a tall cabinet by the entry for people to slide their shoes into before going into the main play area. A plump older woman with dyed blonde hair and thick glasses welcomed them to Gymboree. "I'm Edna. Can I ask how old your little ones are and what program you're here for?" Sarah jostled Brian on her hip and replied, "Well, these little ones are all 21 and they're here for the pre-walking play group." "Lovely, you're right on time," Edna declared, then looked at Brian, giving him an exaggerated smile and cooing, "Well, hello there, buddy." "Did you hear that, Brian?" Sarah said to him. "The nice lady said hello. Can you say hi back to her?" "Hi," Brian mumbled, not amused by their condescension. Though it only got worse when Mama grabbed his wrist and made him wave his hand like he was too thick to do so himself. "What a bright little guy," Edna told Sarah. "Yes, he's quite advanced for his age, almost speaks in full sentences already," she bragged. "Oh, that's brilliant, you're a lucky mommy." Sarah nodded and pecked a kiss on her boy's cheek. "Okay, just leave your shoes in the bin and I'll help you get the little ones into the play area." As Mama carried Brian in, he watched the kids playing around him. Several young men were tiptoeing down a balance beam raised a foot off the ground. A group about their age was crawling through a tube on the floor, a multicolored tunnel. Others were swimming about in a sort of ball pit filled with soft shapes. Everyone seemed to be having a good time. Brian was set down on the floor with his Mama sitting behind him. She pulled him back into her lap and he saw that other mothers were sitting with college-aged men and women in their laps, all in a circle. Edna set Meggie and Rachel down on either side of them, showing off incredible strength as she easily carried the two adult women across the room and lowered them to the floor as though it were nothing. In front of them was what Brian recognized as a parachute. It covered a large section of the floor and their circle of moms and babies was formed around it. Edna had left, but another carer who introduced herself as Claire cheerily directed the mothers to each grab a corner of the parachute and to lift it high in the air on her mark. Mama places her mouth right by Brian's ear and whispered, "Okay baby, when Mama lifts the pretty blanket up, you get over to the other side just as fast as you can. Mama will give you a special juice BABA afterwards. Okay mommies, lift." Claire yelled, and the parachute went up. With all the cheers of encouragement, Brian couldn't help but get caught up in the spirit of the thing. He forced himself forward, immediately dropping to his hands and knees and crawling forward. The parachute's primary colors filtered the lights on the ceiling, casting a bright rainbow of light across the floor and the other babies. A young man in a Big Bird romper was creeping faster than Brian, and his competitive streak made him force his hands and legs to move faster. Halfway across and the parachute was coming down, threatening to collapse on them and trap them. With a pounding heartbeat, Brian didn't think how silly that idea was, he just pushed faster. The parachute sprang upwards again just as it seemed ready to touch their heads. Happy with the reprieve, Brian decided to try and walk the rest of the way. Surely with all this adrenaline flowing he could force his muscles to work correctly. He rose to his knees, but it was impossible to get a foot on the floor without something to pull himself up on. A confused-looking Rachel reached his side, also on her hands and knees. Without a word he grabbed her shoulders and used the girl to push himself up. She glared at him and called out in surprise. But he didn't care, his knees had straightened and he could feel the carpet under his bare soles. He was standing. With wide, halting steps he moved forward. He could hear Mama shouting her praises as he took step after step. Mamas on the other side of the circle were nodding and smiling at him, and that made him feel all good and warm inside. He made it a full 6 steps upright before his ankle rolled and he dropped heavily to his hands and knees again. But at least he'd made it all the way to the other side. Just as he reached the mama on that side, the silky material of the parachute brushed over his head and neck as it dropped to the floor. Brian smiled up at her, proud he'd made it in time. She knelt before him and tickled him under the chin. "What a cutie pie you are," she said. Brian was starting to feel like a puppy, on his hands and knees being petted. He pulled back and looked around for his mama. She wasn't where he'd left her anymore. Immediately he started to panic. He needed Mama so much. She did everything for him because he couldn't do anything for himself anymore. If she disappeared, what would become of him? He wanted Mama now. "Mama," he called out, tears forming in his eyes. "Where Mama?" A hand on his shoulder and the scent of Mama immediately soothed him. "Sha sweetie, Mama's right here baby," she assured, pulling him into a much-needed cuddle. Brian slowed down his rapid breathing as he cuddled in her arms. He had to remind himself that he was being silly, that Mama would never abandon him. He was her baby and she loved him so much. No, she'd never leave him. Once he'd calmed down a bit, Mama produced a nice big BABA filled with apple juice. It looked so appealing, he grabbed for it right away, though he had trouble holding it at first. After dropping it to the floor once, Mama helped him to grip it with both hands. He took the rubber nipple in his mouth and began to suckle. The juice was nice and sweet, quenching his thirst and tasting good. He sucked greedily, downing half the bottle in a matter of moments. "What a thirsty little man," Mama commented. Brian took the nipple out of his mouth long enough to declare, "Yummy. I'm glad you like your BABA, honey." It seemed all too soon the BABA was empty. Mama took it away and Brian saw that the others had disappeared. He spotted Rachel across the parachute, now sat in a big baby walker like at Meg's house. This one was a bit more basic, just a white walker with mesh seat and a tray. Rachel wasn't happy about being in the contraption. She hadn't even tried to walk since the day before. She was happy to stay on the ground, where she was at least free to roam. This thing kept her all cooped up, unable to reach anything beyond the tray. Her bowed legs felt funny dangling like that, and it was strange pushing the thing about with toes just brushing the carpet. Rachel had been a bit jealous of Brian when he'd been placed in one the night before, but now she knew that was stupid. She was getting right into a good sulk when an idea popped into her head. She looked over at Sarah, standing near Brian, fitting his empty bottle back into her overfilled bag. The bag that was sitting precariously on the edge of a chair. With all her strength, Rachel dug her toes into the carpet and pushed off in Sarah's direction. Her floppy legs did the best they could and she picked up speed, aiming right for the mother's butt. Brian wasn't sure what his friend was doing. She had a look of insane determination as she flailed her legs within the saucer and scooted faster and faster towards him and Mama. As she got closer, he realized she wasn't going to stop. What the hell, he thought. But there was no time to warn Mama, for Rachel had given one last thrust and then careened into her. Yow! Sarah cried out as the walker slammed into her heel and hip. Oopsie! Rachel called out innocently, a wicked smile on her face as Sarah collapsed in a heap and the bag toppled onto the floor, spilling its contents everywhere. The bottles, clean diapers, makeup, wipes, all of it was spilled across the carpet. And right in the middle of the pile, the book. The only problem was Rachel couldn't reach it. Once again she was trapped in a baby's toy, her salvation just out of grasp. Sarah was already recovering, so Rachel knew there was only one solution. She gave Brian a desperate look, then pushed aside her pride and cried out. War! She wailed, forcing snot out of her nose, shaking her head and making like she was crying her eyes out. Sarah's attention went from the spilled bag to the distraught baby and she immediately was at the girl's side, trying to comfort her. While Rachel was being cuddled and assured it was okay by Mama, Brian crept over to the pile and found the book, snatching it up and crawling away as quickly as he could. The sound of Rachel wailing got more distant as he made a beeline for one of the tunnels. He didn't dare look back as he crawled in behind a slightly older man in bright red overalls. Keeping his hands just behind the man's wiggling bare feet, Brian silently willed him to hurry it up. Finally they reached the other side of the tunnel and with no one behind him, Brian was alone and hidden. Brian held the book in his hand and thought carefully about what to do. He decided there was no point trying to make it turn him grown up again. He would just try to get a bit older, then he could fix things more easily. So he spoke softly to the book, saying being a grown up was bad. I weak being a more widdle. But not a baby. Wanna be a widdle boy, go to school and play. Please, make me widdle boy. Nothing happened, so Brian tried a new tack. Okay, I stay baby, but not my friends. Make em big again. You got me. Just let em go, he offered, hoping that once they were older his friends could find a way to save him too. If the book demanded a victim, maybe it would be satisfied with just him. There were no wavy lines of energy, no eerie glow emanating from the book. It didn't do a damn thing. Brian felt lost, he'd given it his all and had nothing to show for it. He felt his rage at the stupid book grow by the second. Come on, stupid book, do something, he roared. Still nothing. I hate you. You make everything bad, he yelled, slamming the book onto the floor and hitting it. What happened next wasn't at all what he'd been expecting. The book didn't start to glow, there was no slow change. Instead there was a blinding flash of light and a wave of searing heat from the cursed book. Photo shoot. When his eyes adjusted from the flash, nothing seemed to have changed. He was still in the tunnel, still at Gymboree and still dressed in the striped romper. Only the book itself seemed to be different. It had become plastic. It was now a rounded puffy plastic infant's book with pictures of little yellow duckies on the cover. Barpooth, he mocked the book. Brian blinked. What had he said? That didn't sound right at all. He concentrated and declared, Marth, Barbaboo. No. This was all wrong, the book had robbed him of his ability to speak. How could he fix anything now? He couldn't, that was the simple answer. He just couldn't. There was something wet dripping on his hands. Brian saw bubbly liquid on his fingers, then he felt the wetness on his chin as well. He was drooling, spittle coating his chin and hanging from it. Brian had to concentrate on keeping his mouth closed to keep the saliva from running over his lips. Feeling inside his mouth with his tongue revealed that his teeth were all completely gone now. Fighting the panic rising up inside him, Brian began to crawl out of the enclosing space of the tunnel. His arms promptly gave out and he found himself flat on his tummy. Brian scooted on his tummy, legs flailing behind him like a frog until he was free of the tunnel. Just holding his head upright seemed to take an effort now. His muscles had turned to jelly. Even when he wasn't crawling, his legs twitched and his feet wiggled. The motor control areas of his brain were back to complete infancy now. As he left the tube and looked about the room, he discovered that his visual acuity had also decreased. He'd never needed glasses, but now everything in the distance was blurry. However, things nearby remained perfectly clear and he was able to see the woman lying on the floor facing him. For a second he didn't recognize the adult-sized infant, even though he could see her just fine. Then the face staring at him clicked into place and he gasped at Meggie. He hadn't recognized her until now because she looked very different than a minute ago. Meggie was bald, her lovely hair completely missing from her head. She was gaping at him slack-jawed with drool pouring freely from her toothless mouth. Despite the bald head and toothless mouth, it was actually her eyes which showed Brian the most prominent and disturbing change. Before, she'd been wide-eyed and innocent-looking, sure. But something had happened in this last transformation, some threshold had been crossed. Now her eyes were completely vacant, empty of all personality or even a flicker of intelligent thought. Whatever had been left of adult Megan, the little flicker of her old self he'd still seen even as she babbled and messed her diaper, it was completely gone now. Her mind had undeveloped to the point that she was nothing but an empty-headed little infant, albeit in a grown-up body. Meggie blinked those big unthinking eyes, pursed her wet lips and blew a raspberry, saliva bubbles escaping the corners of her mouth. Brian just shook his head in disgust. Then he had a terrible thought, bringing his hand to the top of his head and sighing with relief as he felt hair. Granted, it felt thinner than before and was probably so light it appeared blonde by now, but still it was hair. "Well, there you are," a voice called from just behind him. Brian managed to twist his head enough to see Mama there, hands on her hips, grinning down at him. "How did you get all the way over here, Bree?" she asked. "Badu," he babbled, forgetting he could no longer form proper words. Mama giggled at his cute babbling and picked him up. The feelings of helplessness he'd been having since this began now became complete. He was limp as a ragdoll in Mama's arms. From Meg's behavior and his lack of speech or motor control, he now estimated his abilities at the 5 or maybe 6-month-old level. As Mama rested him against her bosom and cradled his bottom with her arm, he felt that his diaper seemed much thicker as well, the leg holes no longer contoured to fit a learning walker or even a crawler. For several disorienting seconds he could only see Mama's shirt as she carried him across the room. Then she set him down in a strange seat that wrapped around him with a section sticking up between his legs. He recalled that this was called a bumbo. It was designed to keep a small infant sitting upright, preventing him flopping over on his back or tummy. It forced his legs straight out in front of him where he watched them twitch and wiggle seemingly on their own. Rachel was sat in a pink bumbo right next to his. Though her outfit hadn't changed, her hair had become thinner as well and she too had a romper collar that was now wet with drool. Brian gave her a pitiful look, wishing he could tell her how sorry was that he'd only made things worse for them again. She glared back at him, opening her mouth as though ready to yell at him, but shut it again when the only result was more spittle down her chin. For 5 minutes they were forced to sit there trapped in their bumbo chairs watching other older kids play. With each demotion they appreciated what they'd had before. At least at the last level they were mobile and could communicate to some degree. Rachel thought she'd even enjoy being back in one of those baby walkers now. At least that was a vehicle of sorts. When Sarah and Joy returned from changing Danny into a new diaper, they set about entertaining the bored-looking babies. Danny was plopped on the floor to creep while the two mommies shook rattles before Brian and Rachel. Neither baby wanted to show any interest, even though the noises were undeniably attention-grabbing for both. Was this what their future held? How could they ever be happy contained to baby seats and forced to watch the world go by while their mothers gave them silly toys that could never entertain their adult minds? Sarah frowned at Bree-Bree's lack of interest in the rattle. "Come on, sweetie, look at the pretty rattle," she urged. "Looky, looky, Bree-Bree," she cooed to the boy, shaking it right before his eyes. Brian glanced at the rattle at last and then his eyes seemed locked on it. "Yes, there we go. There's my happy baby. Who weekays his whittle wattle? Does Bree-Bree? I think he does. I think he wants to chew it, doesn't he?" Brian began to reach out for the toy, despite himself. Mama let him take it into his hands and he found the urge to put it in his mouth was indeed irresistible. He gummed the hard plastic, slobbering over the toy and feeling ashamed by his infantile explorations. At least until he looked over and saw that Rachel was smiling and squealing with glee as her mama tickled the soles of her feet. Maybe this wasn't so bad after all. Brian felt light tickles brush up and down his own feet as mama copied Joy. The nerves down there seemed to have become super sensitive and he shivered with ecstasy, smiling around the rattle and giggling uncontrollably. Mama was so funny. How could getting a little tickle be so much fun? Bree-Bree likes getting icals on him's footses. Look at that silly smile. Sarah baby talked to him. Do you love your mama? Can Bree-Bree tell me who he loves? Say mama for me, sweetie. I know you can do it, just say mama for me. Feeling alive with silliness as the tickles continued, Brian opened his mouth and tried his best to make his mama happy. "Mba," he crowed. "Ooh, that was close, sweetie," mama declared. "Try again, sweetie. Come on, ickle bwibwi, tell mama who you love. Say mama." Brian concentrated on getting his tongue in the right place, then opened his mouth, ignoring the flood of drool that caused, and said, "Mama." Sarah leapt with joy, clapping her hands and then leaning it to plant several big smooches on her baby man's face. "He said it. Did you hear that, Joy?" "I sure did." Joy nodded, happy for her friend. Turning to her girl, she said, "Can you do that, sweetie? Can you say mama like you little friend?" Rachel was still giggling from her tickles and decided to give it a try. "Dadu," she blathered unsuccessfully. Joy chuckled at her daughter's attempt. "Oh well, it was close, sweetie, but I'm afraid it's mama, not dada." "She'll get it soon enough," Sarah assured the other mother. "Yes, soon enough she'll be crawling and speaking real words and everything. I'll just enjoy her cute little babbles while I still can." Amanda reappeared with bald little Meggie on her hip. "Hey guys, we better get going if we're gonna get those photos done," she reminded them. "Oh goodness, you're right, we need to get going," Sarah agreed as Joy nodded. Brian and Rachel were picked up out of their bumbo seats, Brian still mouthing his rattle, and were carried out of the play area to their waiting stroller. It had changed since they were last in it though. Now instead of being two abreast there was one seat behind another. Amanda slipped Meggie into the rear seat while Rachel found herself placed in the middle one. A set of plastic toys dangled above her head just in reach of her hands. Also facing her was a little mirror secured to the back of the seat in front of her. In it she could finally get a glimpse of herself and it wasn't a pretty picture. She could see the drool glistening on her chin, how thin and wild her hair was, the darkened soaking wet front of her romper. Even with her obvious breasts showing, she looked like an overgrown infant in every way. Brian was sat in the front seat, his legs now divided by part of the handrest. It had holes built into it holding a BABA and several toys. Once Sue and Danny were secured in their own separate stroller, they all made their way out of Gymboree and through the mall again. This time Brian wasn't paying attention to the sights, his attention was locked on the toys attached to his stroller. He didn't seem able to look away. Hitting at them over and over was just so enjoyable. Rachel felt just the same in the seat behind him. She lay back in her chair batting at the dangling toys, making them spin about and light up. It seemed like no time at all had passed before they were at their destination and their mommies were lifting them out of the stroller. Rachel actually cried out when she was lifted free. She wanted to play with the toy more. She screeched at her mama to make her stop, but that accomplished nothing. Mama just sat down on a seat with Rachel on her lap. It only occurred to Rachel a bit later that this was surely uncomfortable for Mama, as she weighed at least as much as she did. Nevertheless, Mama began to bounce Rachel on her knee, calming her down. The up and down motion was quite relaxing, in fact. She liked the sensation as well as the knowledge she was safe on Mama's lap. Once she was calmer, she was able to reflect on her recent behavior. It troubled her that she so easily accepted playing with baby toys as fun and that she'd just screamed and babbled nonsense when she was upset, like that was a normal response to things going wrong. Just the idea that she'd thrown a tantrum over losing a flashing yellow baby toy was enough to make her feel like an idiot. They were at a photography studio somewhere in the mall now. The waiting area they were in was not separated from the actual studio, so they could see the whole setup. The walls were all painted black and there was a very complicated, expensive-looking camera on a tripod in the middle of the room. There were several backgrounds available, but the one he had down at the moment was simple blue sky and clouds. There was a desk with a cash register and beside it a clothing rack with all sorts of outfits. The waiting area walls were covered in photos, some color, some black and white. It appeared from these shots that the man here specialized in baby photos. That was probably a pretty good industry if people stayed babies for over 20 years. The shots displayed showed naked or diaper-clad young men and women smiling eagerly for the camera. One had a teen girl clothed only in a diaper chewing on a big string of what were meant to be mommy's pearls, giggling her pigtailed head off. Another featured a 20-something man in a plastic kiddie fireman hat and shirtless with blue jean shorts pulling a giant red radio flyer wagon in which a lanky teen boy was seated, he with a dumb infantile grin and naked but for a diaper as well. Once Joy was satisfied that Rachel was calm enough, she was carried over to a large playpen in the corner and deposited there. The other babies were already all in it. Rachel noticed that Sue and Danny hadn't really changed this time. It appeared they were now all about the same level of development. Those two and Meggie were happily lying on their backs or tummies gnawing on the simple baby toys in the playpen. Rachel and Brian still had enough self-control not to touch toys that countless young men and women must have slobbered over. This pen was surely rife with baby germs. That didn't stop their baby-minded compatriots from offering them toys. Baba, Danny babbled to his sister, offering her a drool-soaked green teething ring. Rachel shook her head, unable even to say the word no to her brother. He stared blankly at her a moment, then returned the teething ring to his own mouth, blowing spit bubbles around it. Rachel gagged and looked away. She didn't like to see how far Danny had fallen. As with Meggie, his eyes were now devoid of recognition or any real thought process. "We'll start with your older girl then," a male voice announced from outside the pen. Rachel tried to see through the mesh, but it was too tough. Only when the man appeared over the railing, gazing disinterestedly down at them, did she see the photographer. Amanda appeared at his side a second later and together they lifted Meggie out of the pen. "Here we go, baby," Amanda crooned to her girl. "Let's get you in your special outfit for your photos." After a short time, Joy and Sarah appeared again, looming above them as though giants. Being in the huge playpen warped their perspectives. Rachel and Brian found themselves being lifted out. "Let's get you guys ready to be stars," Sarah joked. Meggie was already having her turn in the spotlight, quite literally. With her mother right beside the photographer, Meggie was alone on the studio floor with all the floodlights focused on her. The outfit she worn was discarded in a heap by the tripod. Instead, she'd now had a white ribbon tied around the crown of her bald head, a big pink bow affixed to it just above the right of her forehead. She wore that and nothing else. Even her diaper was discarded with her other clothes. She was lying naked on her tummy on a thick white section of shag carpet, long bare legs askew behind her, smooth bum lifted slightly in the air, boobies on display as she craned her neck and gaped at the squeaky ducky toy her mother held. Her blank eyes followed the toy's every movement, and each time it squeaked her face was lit with an open-mouthed grin, which the photographer dutifully caught in photo after photo. "Good girl, Meggie, look at the pretty ducky," Amanda encouraged. Meggie couldn't so much as reach for the toy, or crawl towards it. But she was content to look at it and smile at the funny noise it made anyway. When they'd taken enough shots of that pose, Amanda put away the toy and went to her daughter's side, rolling her onto her back on the carpet. "Good girl, Meggie is a good baby," she cooed. Then she began to tickle Meggie's soles, making the girl giggle as Rachel had at the treatment earlier. Only Amanda was also pedaling Meggie's feet in the air above her. "Look at your tootses," she sing-songed to the naked woman. Sure enough, Meggie grabbed one of her feet and yanked it back and forth. Amanda stepped back and the photographer snapped shots of her playing with her feet, pulling them back and forth and finally jamming several toes in her mouth to suck on. "There we go. That's my little toe muncher," Amanda announced. "That'll be our next Christmas card." When Meggie finished her toe-sucking session, Amanda got her re-diapered and back in her baby outfit. Now it was going to be one of their turns. The photographer came over and asked who would be next. "Well, let's get the boy out of the way," Sarah stepped up. "If that's okay with you, Joy." "No problem, go ahead." "Okay," the photographer agreed. "Let's get him dressed properly. What do you think? For an infant of his age, I always say just a diaper or nothing at all is cutest." "Okay, let's do it with just his DP, so he doesn't make a mess." The man nodded and went off to prepare his camera. Brian was lowered to the ground and laid powerless while his mama slipped his romper off him. Then he was carried over to the white rug and laid on his tummy. The rug was warm and tickly, but he refused to smile. The last thing he wanted was his humiliation permanently captured on film. He was determined to ruin the photo shoot any way he could. Mama stepped back and the man handed her the ducky. She dutifully began to wave it around, squeaking it playfully. Brian wouldn't play ball so easily. He pointedly refused to even look up at the ducky, lest it actually capture his attention. Instead, he looked intently down at the carpet. If they couldn't see his face, they had no photo. "Come on, sweetie, look at the ducky." Mama called in vain. "Quack quack," she imitated, with no result. Finally, she turned to the photographer and shrugged. "I don't know what's wrong with him," she declared. "He's usually very good with strangers. I don't understand why he's so shy all of a sudden." "It's okay, miss, I've seen this before." "Has he been fed recently?" "Well, no, he hasn't had his lunch yet," she admitted. "Then you should feed him now. That often calms them down, makes them more relaxed." Sarah nodded. "Of course, I'll do that right now, thanks." With that, she swept Brian back up and carried him out of the shop and into the mall, not bothering to put his romper back on him. Pleased though he was at foiling the photoshoot, he wasn't happy about being taken into the mall in nothing but his diaper. He clung as tightly as he could to Mama, hoping to shield his body from public view. "Why are you being so cranky today, little guy?" Mama crooned to him. "Maybe you are just hungry," she mused. Mama sat down at a bench just down from the studio, swinging Brian's weak, useless legs onto the bench beside her and resting his head in her lap. It was a weird position for him to be in, looking up at her that way. He watched as she undid the buttons on her blouse. What was she doing that for? Brian shrieked when she pulled back the blouse to reveal a nursing bra. Brian squirmed wildly but couldn't get free. She had a firm grip on him to keep her baby from falling, and he didn't have the strength to pull away from her. She seemed quite concerned by her baby's fit, but couldn't understand what was wrong. Sure, it's okay baby, it's okay. Mama's here Bree, right here, and she's not going anywhere. Brian shook his head, willing her to understand. Bana. Egar, he jabbered incoherently. Here baby, have come to Mama, she said, pulling his head to her breast. Brian shook with revulsion as his mother's bared breast filled his vision. He wouldn't. The breast brushed his cheek and some unknown instinct took over and his head twisted on its own accord until the teat brushed across his lips. They opened and took the brown fleshy bit into his mouth. Once it was there, he couldn't stop himself from suckling, just like he did on the pacifier or the BABA. It was better than his binky or BABA, in fact. It was warm and soft and felt so natural. The creamy warm liquid that squirted into his mouth was the best tasting thing he could ever remember having. Once taste was all it took to be hooked. Brian suckled on, swallowing a tummyful of Mama's milk. This was Mama inside of him, warming him, providing for him. He could see only the skin of her boob, but it didn't matter. He wasn't thinking about anything, just existing in the moment. Time meant nothing while he was feeding. All he knew was everything was perfect. He was barely awake when the suction was broken. The lovely nipple slipped from between his lips, some milk dribbling down his chin and wetting his chest. Mama closed up her blouse while he lay with his head rested in the crook of her elbow, staring wordlessly up at her, still smiling with delight. He didn't struggle as she lifted him back up and carried him into the studio again. It was only once there that his mind seemed to flick back on and he realized where he was and what he'd just done. Suddenly he wanted to vomit up the milk he'd just drunk. He thought about all the people in the mall who'd passed by and seen him feeding like that. People had actually seen him, a 21-year-old man, feeding at his mother's breast, naked but for a diaper right there in the mall. How could he ever go back to normal after that? And what was worse, he felt a burning desire to do it again. It tasted so good and it felt so wonderful. He was addicted.